Hey everyone, a few weeks after my video on whether Patrick Bateman, the protagonist from the film classic American Psycho, is a true psychopath, I would like to revisit this topic because I have read various viewpoints online about whether Arthur Fleck, or rather the Joker, is also a psychopath. But what is my basis for evaluation? The Psychopathy Checklist, revised, or PCLR, is a psychological assessment tool for evaluating psychopathy, particularly in incarcerated individuals. It distinguishes psychopathy from antisocial personality disorder and consists of 20 items based on a semi-structured interview and the analysis of records. Psychopaths often exhibit a mix of narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial traits, including superficial charm, promiscuity, emotional instability, lack of empathy, and paranoid as well as sadistic tendencies. The PCL was developed in the 1970s by Robert D. Hare, based on research with male offenders and the works of psychiatrist Hervey M. Cleckley. The application of the test should only be carried out by qualified experts under standardized conditions, as incorrect assessments can have serious consequences for those affected. The test includes two factors: personality traits and behavioral patterns that correlate with antisocial behavior. The PCLR is frequently used in forensic clinics and prisons to decide on parole extensions, treatment, or release. In addition, it serves as a risk assessment tool for recidivism, particularly for violent and sexual offenders. Although the test provides reliable results in research environments, the agreement between different evaluators in practice is often problematic, especially when assessing personality traits. Nevertheless, I would like to apply this checklist today to Arthur Fleck, the protagonist from the 2019 film Joker. Is Joker a psychopath, or is he misunderstood by his fans? I want to find that out today by going through all 20 items and explaining how I would rate them. Let's get into it. Psychopaths are often exceptionally eloquent, charming, and self-confident in their interactions with others. They can appear charismatic and use their words strategically to gain trust or manipulate people. Their charm, however, is not genuine, but superficial and strategic. Typical behaviors are: they appear eloquent and often have a captivating narrative style. Psychopaths use humor and wit deliberately to impress others, and their conversations are often superficial, but they skillfully adapt to different conversation partners. They often speak in a persuasive or theatrical manner. Their manner of speaking can be ingratiating or overly polite. They have a salesperson mentality. This means they know how to win others over to their side. This behavior serves manipulation. Psychopaths use language deliberately to manipulate others for their own purposes. They imitate emotional expressions to appear trustworthy or charismatic, even though they are actually emotionless. An example: a psychopath working as a businessman can present himself as charming and eloquent to convince investors to invest in his fraudulent project. True charisma arises from empathy and an authentic personality. A psychopath, on the other hand, only appears charming to manipulate others. Their interest in others is not genuine. Arthur Fleck shows no superficial charm or rhetorical skill. He is socially awkward, often appears nervous, and has difficulty interacting with people. His laughter at inappropriate moments is a consequence of his neurological condition. It often makes him uncomfortably noticeable in social situations, instead of making him appear charismatic. Arthur is not articulate and has trouble expressing himself clearly and confidently. He shows no ability to influence people through clever rhetoric or charm. His behavior often seems inappropriate, awkward, or desperate, rather than convincing or charismatic. Since no superficial charm or manipulative eloquence is apparent, he deserves 0 points in this item. Psychopaths consider themselves superior, more intelligent, or more talented than others. Their self-image is greatly inflated, regardless of actual abilities or achievements. They often see themselves as extraordinary or misunderstood geniuses. Typical behaviors are: they brag about their supposed successes or abilities, even if these are exaggerated or fabricated. Psychopaths believe that rules, laws, or societal norms do not apply to them and they react with contempt or anger when criticized. They see themselves as victims of envy or unfair treatment when they fail, and they set unrealistic goals without any actual effort. This behavior serves to protect their fragile ego. Psychopaths do not have a normal emotional self-awareness, so they construct an exaggerated self-image to feel superior. An example: an unemployed psychopath claims that he doesn't have a job because society is stupid and doesn't recognize his genius. Healthy self-confidence is based on real abilities and experiences. Psychopathic grandiosity is based on self-deception and exaggeration. Arthur Fleck suffers from low self-esteem and considers himself insignificant. His desire to be successful as a stand-up comedian does not stem from a sense of superiority, but from a desperate need for recognition. Arthur is often humiliated and oppressed by his surroundings, which further reinforces his low self-esteem. His fantasies about fame or being liked by talk show host Murray Franklin are not an expression of megalomania, but a coping mechanism to escape his bleak reality. When he finally gains fame as the Joker, he seems to feel more comfortable, but this is based more on a newly discovered identity than on an inflated self-perception. Since he does not exhibit an inflated sense of self-worth or narcissism, he deserves 0 points in this item. Psychopaths have a low tolerance for boredom and constantly seek new stimuli, often in the form of risks or extreme behavior. They get bored quickly and need excitement or drama. Typical behaviors are: they tend to exhibit impulsive behavior, for example gambling, speeding, drug use. They often break rules or laws because otherwise they get bored, and they are constantly on the lookout for new kicks or extreme experiences. Psychopaths do not fulfill long-term commitments because they lose interest. They frequently change jobs, hobbies, or relationships because they get bored quickly. Psychopaths often have reduced activity in the limbic system, the area of the brain that processes emotions and rewards. As a result, they quickly feel bored and constantly seek new stimuli to feel alive. An example: a psychopath may repeatedly place risky bets or engage in illegal car races simply because the thrill gives them a short-term sense of satisfaction. Normal people enjoy adventures but can also tolerate periods of calm. Psychopaths need constant stimulation and often destroy their own lives to get it. Arthur shows no tendency to get bored quickly or constantly seek new stimuli. His leisure activities are rather monotonous and uneventful. He takes care of his sick mother. He spends a lot of time alone in his apartment and he repeatedly watches the Murray Franklin show. He is trying to succeed as a stand-up comedian, but not in an impulsive or addictive way. Psychopaths with a high score in this item tend to engage in risky behavior, excessive partying, or criminal activities out of boredom. Arthur does not exhibit such behaviors. His escalation to violence does not happen out of a need for stimulation, but as a desperate reaction to his hopeless situation. Since no increased need for stimulation is apparent, he earns 0 points in this item. Psychopaths often lie, excessively and without any apparent reason. They invent stories, deceive others, and manipulate reality without feeling any guilt. Typical behaviors are: they lie even when it brings no advantage, and their lies are often extremely complex and well thought out. They lie so convincingly that sometimes they even believe it themselves. Psychopaths change their stories when they get caught, without hesitation. They lie to manipulate or control others. Lying is a tool for psychopaths to gain power over others. They have no normal moral sense and do not see lying as wrong. An example: a psychopath claims to be a doctor, even though he has no medical training. Normal people occasionally lie to avoid problems or not hurt others. Psychopaths lie systematically, manipulatively, and often without reason. Arthur Fleck shows no tendency to lie pathologically or manipulatively. He lives in fantasies and delusions, but that is different from purposeful, calculated lying. His relationship with Sophie is a delusion, not a deliberate lie. Psychopaths with high scores on this item often lie to get out of trouble or to deliberately manipulate others. Arthur does not do this. His misjudgment of his origin, the assumption that Thomas Wayne is his father, is based on his mother's deception, not on his own conscious manipulation. Since no pathological tendency to lie is evident, he deserves 0 points in this item. Psychopaths exploit and manipulate other people to achieve their own goals. They have no problem deceiving, cheating, or emotionally manipulating others. Typical behaviors are: they deliberately use charm or emotional manipulation to exploit others. They make up stories to evoke sympathy or get money, and they feign affection or love to gain advantages. Psychopaths take what they want, without regard for others. They exploit people for money, status, or personal gratification. Psychopaths do not see others as equal human beings, but as tools to fulfill their own desires. An example: a psychopath pretends to be seriously ill to get money from family and friends. Normal people influence others through arguments or social interaction. Psychopaths use deception, manipulation, and ruthlessness to exploit others. Arthur Fleck does not consciously manipulate or deceive anyone to gain an advantage. His actions are more characterized by desperation and social awkwardness than by intent to manipulate. Psychopaths who score high on this item use lies and deception to deliberately manipulate others. Arthur shows no such behaviors. His fantasies about social recognition as a popular comedian are not attempts at deception, but rather expressions of his deep loneliness. His acts of murder are not a form of deception or manipulation, but impulsive reactions to years of mistreatment and humiliation. Since no deliberate manipulation or fraudulent intentions are apparent, he deserves 0 points in this item. Psychopaths feel no guilt or remorse for their actions, even if they have caused great harm to others. They can do cruel or immoral things without feeling regret or remorse. Typical behaviors are: they don't apologize or only do it when it benefits them. They show no emotional involvement, even when their actions had catastrophic consequences. Psychopaths blame others instead of taking responsibility, and they justify their misconduct. They feel no guilt, even if they have destroyed someone's life. Psychopaths have reduced activity in the limbic system, particularly in the amygdala, which is responsible for feelings of guilt and moral judgment. They do not experience a genuine emotional reaction to the suffering of others. An example: a psychopathic murderer can sit in court without showing any emotion, even when the victims' families are crying and begging him to show remorse. Normal people feel guilty when they harm others. A psychopath feels no inner conflict or remorse. Arthur Fleck shows mixed signs of guilt or remorse. After the murder of the 3 young men in the subway, he appears shocked, runs away in panic, and hides in a public restroom. But instead of showing remorse, he begins a slow, almost ecstatic dance. This suggests that he feels more liberated than guilty. After he killed Randall with a pair of scissors, he shows no signs of guilt or compassion. Afterwards, he behaves calmly and even engages in a casual conversation with Gary, whom he then lets go unharmed. After the murder of Murray Franklin on the live show, Arthur justifies his act as revenge on a society that has mistreated him, but shows no remorse or regret. So why not 2 points? He shows some signs of discomfort and confusion after his first murders, indicating that he is not completely free of guilt. His development towards complete indifference to his actions happens gradually, which means that he did not lack remorse from the beginning. Therefore, 1 point is an appropriate rating. He does show some lack of guilt, but he is not completely incapable of remorse. Psychopaths have a limited or superficial emotional depth. Their feelings are shallow, inauthentic, or feigned. Typical behaviors are: her emotions seem forced or artificial. They can feign emotions, for example sadness or joy, to manipulate others. Psychopaths show little or no emotional reaction to tragic events. Their moods change quickly and unpredictably, and they experience emotions only briefly or very weakly. The brains of psychopaths process emotions differently. The amygdala, which is responsible for emotional reactions, shows less activity. Therefore, they do not experience deep emotions such as fear, compassion, or sorrow. An example: a psychopath learns that a close relative has died but shows no grief or distress. Instead, he asks if he will receive the inheritance. Some people show emotions less openly, but feel them deeply. A psychopath actually feels emotions only superficially or not at all. Arthur Fleck displays deep and intense emotions, even if they are sometimes misguided or uncontrolled. He suffers from depression and loneliness, which is reflected in his body language, facial expressions, and actions. His crying is genuine. Several times in the film, you see him cry or be desperate, a clear sign that he has no superficial or artificial emotions. His anger is also authentic. When he realizes that his mother has been lying to him for years, he reacts with genuine anger and disappointment. His laughter is a neurological disorder, not manipulation. A psychopath with a high shallow affect score would consciously use his laughter as a means of manipulation, which is not the case here. Therefore, 0 points is the appropriate rating. Psychopaths have no empathy for others. They can be cruel or cold, without caring about the suffering of their fellow human beings. Typical behaviors are: they do not react emotionally to the suffering of others, and they can intentionally hurt people without showing any emotions. Psychopaths take advantage of others without caring about their feelings, and they feel no remorse when they harm someone. They mock or ridicule people who are suffering. Empathy is the ability to put oneself in others' shoes. In psychopaths, this ability is impaired. The neural networks responsible for empathy are inactive or weakly developed in them. An example: a psychopath sees someone being beaten and feels no concern or sympathy for the victim. Instead, he might even find it funny. Some people don't show their empathy strongly, but they still feel it. A psychopath actually feels no empathy, even in extreme situations. Arthur Fleck occasionally exhibits callous behavior, but not consistently. After the murder of Randall, he shows no signs of pity or sorrow. He kills him in a brutal manner. He also cold-bloodedly kills Murray Franklin on the talk show, without any empathy for the shocked audience or Franklin's family. However, he is not naturally emotionless. He shows affection towards his mother, although that changes later. He treats Gary, his short-statured colleague, kindly and lets him go unharmed. In earlier scenes, he shows compassion for children by playing with them. So why not 2 points? A psychopathic murderer with a complete lack of empathy would have also killed Gary or not cared for the child on the bus. Arthur develops his cold-heartedness only after numerous humiliations and psychological breakdowns, which suggests that it is more of an emotional hardening than an innate trait. Therefore, 1 point is appropriate. He sometimes shows callous behavior, but not consistently. Psychopaths live at the expense of others and avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. They exploit people to gain financial or material advantages. Typical behaviors are: they live off other people without providing anything in return, and they rely on family, friends, or partners instead of working themselves. Psychopaths use fraud, manipulation, or deception to get by. They frequently change relationships or friendships to exploit new victims, and they often don't have a stable job or avoid honest work. Psychopaths see no point in working hard or making long-term plans. They prefer to exploit others because they feel superior and believe that life should be made easy for them. An example: a psychopathic man has been living off his girlfriend for years without working. He constantly persuades her to give him money and threatens to leave her if she refuses. Some people are unemployed or financially dependent because they have no other choice. A psychopath could work, but prefers to exploit others. Arthur Fleck does not live at the expense of others, but fights for survival. He has an honest job as a clown and is trying to make a living, so he doesn't consciously take advantage of anyone. His mother does live with him, but he takes care of her, not the other way around. Arthur is in financial trouble, but he is trying to stay independent instead of getting by through fraud or manipulation. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths have poor impulse control and tend to have sudden outbursts of anger or engage in thoughtless behavior. They find it difficult to restrain themselves when they are frustrated or want something. Typical behaviors are: they react aggressively or violently to the slightest provocations. They scream, hit, or threaten people impulsively. Psychopaths break laws or rules because they have no self-control and they explode emotionally and then calm down immediately. They have a short fuse and lose their temper quickly. Psychopaths have a disrupted function in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for impulse control and rational thinking. As a result, they cannot manage their emotions and reactions well. An example: a psychopath is insulted in a bar and immediately hits the other guest without thinking. Later, he shows no remorse for his behavior. Some people are irritable, but they still have control over their behavior. Psychopaths act extremely impulsively and violently, without regard for consequences. Arthur Fleck shows occasional impulsive outbursts of aggression, but he is not consistently out of control. He loses control when he is attacked in the subway, leading to his first killing. However, it can be argued that this was a reaction to years of oppression and abuse. He attacks Randall when he visits him, which is extremely brutal and results from a sudden outburst of anger. He reacts impulsively on the Murray Franklin show by shooting the host, a sign of poor impulse control. However, he remains calm in many other moments, even when provoked, for example when his stand-up show fails or when he is fired by his boss. So why not 2 points? A psychopathic character with completely poor impulse control would constantly and randomly explode. Arthur, however, often remains calm until the pressure builds up and escalates. Therefore, 1 point is appropriate. He has occasional outbursts of anger and loss of control, but no persistent impulsivity. Psychopaths exhibit casual, indiscriminate, and often reckless sexual behavior characterized by a lack of emotional attachment, manipulation, and impulsivity. Typical behaviors are frequently changing sexual partners without emotional attachment. Their sexual relationships are used to exploit or manipulate others. Psychopaths have adultery or simultaneous relationships with multiple people, often without regard for their feelings. Their sexual activity that is risky, aggressive, or reckless, and they use lying, manipulation, or deception to get sex. They also have no sense of responsibility for the consequences, for example unprotected sex, unwanted pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases. Psychopaths often view sex as a means of power or control, not as an emotional act. Since they do not feel deep bonds, they are promiscuous and see partners more as objects than as people. An example: a psychopath starts multiple parallel relationships, promises each person love, but betrays them all without any feelings of guilt. Promiscuity itself is not psychopathic as long as both partners consent. The difference lies in the manipulation, lack of attachment, and irresponsibility of psychopathic promiscuity. Arthur Fleck shows no signs of promiscuous or risky sexual behavior. He has no real sexual relationships in the film. His supposed relationship with his neighbor Sophie turns out to be a mere delusion. He appears socially awkward and insecure, so he would probably have difficulty even entering into intimate relationships. Psychopaths with a high score in this item often have numerous, superficial sexual partners and use sex manipulatively. This does not apply to Arthur at all. Even in his imagination of a romantic relationship with Sophie, there are no indications of excessive or indiscriminate sexual behavior. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths often exhibit severe behavioral abnormalities in childhood that indicate aggression, criminality, indiscipline, or emotional coldness. Typical behaviors in their childhood are frequent discipline problems at school, for example fights or authority issues, violence against animals or other children, destruction of property or intentional setting of objects on fire, frequent lying, stealing, or manipulating peers. They also show a lack of remorse for bad behavior and a lack of emotional attachment to parents or caregivers. Their frustration tolerance is extremely low, they react impulsively and aggressively. Early behavioral problems can indicate a disrupted development of the brain, particularly in areas for empathy, impulse control, and moral judgment. Studies show that many psychopathic adults exhibited noticeable behaviors already in their childhood. An example: an 8-year-old boy intentionally kills his neighbor's pet without showing any remorse. Many children go through phases of defiance or rebellion. The difference lies in persistent violence, extreme recklessness, and lack of remorse. Arthur Fleck shows no documented or mentioned behavioral problems in his childhood. His past is indeed addressed in the film, but his problems seem to stem more from abuse, neglect, and mental illness than from early antisocial tendencies. According to the information he receives, he was abused as a child, but there are no reports of him being violent or problematic himself. He has no criminal record from his youth or childhood. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths have unrealistic, unstructured, or completely absent life goals. They often set lofty but unattainable goals or show complete aimlessness. Typical behaviors are: they claim to have extraordinary plans but do nothing to achieve them. They constantly change their goals or careers without any real effort. Psychopaths often live in the moment, without thinking about long-term consequences, and they overestimate their own abilities and think success comes without work. They fall into megalomania. Psychopaths tend to be impulsive and unrealistic because they consider themselves superior, but at the same time, they avoid responsibility and effort. They lack the discipline for long-term planning. An example: a psychopath says he will become a world-famous musician, but never practices an instrument and relies on everything happening by itself. Ambitious people have big goals, but they work hard for them. Psychopaths only talk about grand plans, but they never follow through. Arthur Fleck does have significant difficulties in life, but he does have long-term goals that are quite realistic. He dreams of becoming a stand-up comedian, which is difficult but not unrealistic. He is actively striving to achieve this goal. He writes down jokes and performs, albeit unsuccessfully, on a comedy stage. He works as a clown to earn a living, that shows a certain structure in his life. Even though his mental illness makes his path more difficult, he at least initially shows an effort to steer his life in a certain direction. His plans are not irrational. He doesn't want to become, for example, president or a millionaire, but a stand-up comedian. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths act without thinking and make spontaneous, often self-destructive decisions that are based on immediate gratification rather than foresight. Typical behaviors are: they spend large sums of money spontaneously, without thinking about the consequences. They suddenly end relationships or jobs without reason or plan. Psychopaths start risky activities, for example gambling, drug use, on a whim, and they react aggressively or violently to the slightest provocations. They act before they think, often to their own detriment. The brains of psychopathic individuals show reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning and impulse control. An example: a psychopath races through a city at 200 kilometers per hour because he's bored, without thinking about the danger or legal consequences. Spontaneous people are open to new experiences, but can still assess risks. Psychopaths act without regard for consequences, often self-destructively. Arthur Fleck occasionally shows impulsive decisions and loss of control, but not to an extreme degree. In the subway he is provoked and attacked, but his decision to kill all three is spontaneous and unplanned. He kills his former colleague with a pair of scissors without any prior signs of a strategy. The murder of Murray Franklin during the live broadcast is partly impulsive, partly planned, he does have a vague idea beforehand of killing himself or using violence, but the final decision to shoot Murray in that moment does not seem fully thought out. In many other moments, however, he remains composed. When he is humiliated by his colleagues at work, he does not react impulsively at first. When he no longer receives medication from the authorities, he shows frustration but no immediate loss of control. So why not 2 points? A psychopathic character with extreme impulsivity would make almost every decision spontaneously and thoughtlessly. Arthur, on the other hand, plans many of his actions or requires a certain escalation to react. Therefore, he deserves 1 point. He has occasional impulsive outbursts, but he is not consistently impulsive. Psychopaths exhibit a consistent pattern of unreliability, duty violation, and indifference towards obligations. Typical behaviors are: they break promises or commitments without a guilty conscience. They neglect their family, children, or partner, and they don't take care of financial obligations, for example debts, rent or bills. Psychopaths leave jobs suddenly or just stop showing up, and they do not take responsibility for their own misconduct. Psychopaths find obligations burdensome and avoid them whenever possible. Since they have no guilty conscience, they see no need to take responsibility. An example: a psychopath signs a lease but never pays the rent and just moves out when evicted. Everyone can occasionally neglect their responsibilities. Psychopaths exhibit a consistent pattern of extreme irresponsibility, without remorse or effort to improve. Arthur Fleck is not an irresponsible person. His problems do not arise from negligence, but from his mental instability and difficult life circumstances. He is trying to keep his job as a clown, even though he will ultimately be fired. He takes care of his sick mother, which is a sign of responsibility. He is trying to pursue his dreams as a stand-up comedian, which shows that he is planning his future at least to some extent. Psychopaths with a high score in this item exhibit consistently irresponsible behavior, such as not taking care of their children, not paying bills, or deliberately neglecting their work. This does not apply to Arthur. His failure is not due to negligence or lack of interest, but the result of external factors and mental health issues. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths consistently avoid taking responsibility for their misconduct or actions. Instead, they blame others, deny obvious facts, or justify themselves manipulatively. Typical behaviors are: they deny all blame, even when they are clearly responsible. They use excuses or rationalizations, like anyone would have done that, and they project their mistakes onto others. Psychopaths react with anger or defiance when held accountable, and they play the victim to elicit sympathy or avoid consequences. Psychopaths do not feel guilt or remorse, therefore they see no need to take responsibility. Their inflated ego and manipulative character lead them to portray themselves as flawless or superior. An example: a psychopath deceives his business partners and loses their money, but claims that it is their own fault for trusting him. Normal people can make excuses, but eventually recognize their responsibility. Psychopaths consistently deny and show no insight. Arthur shows tendencies in several scenes to blame others for his own behavior instead of taking responsibility for his actions. This becomes particularly evident in his famous line before he shoots Murray Franklin: "What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a system that abandons him and treats him like trash? I'll tell you what you get. You get what you deserve." Here, Arthur directly holds society and his fellow human beings responsible for his violent acts. Instead of acknowledging that his murders were his own decisions, he portrays himself as a victim of an unjust world. He shows a rational justification for his violence, a typical characteristic of this item. However, he also seems to have feelings of guilt, because he cries while shooting Murray, which suggests that he is not completely incapable of taking responsibility. So why not 2 points? A psychopathic character with a full score in this item would consistently and constantly deny any blame, no matter how obvious their responsibility was. Arthur doesn't always do this. In some moments, he shows self-doubt. Therefore, he earns 1 point for this item. He shows occasional blame-shifting, but not to an extreme extent. Psychopaths have a long history of unstable, superficial relationships, often marked by infidelity, manipulation, and irresponsibility. Typical behaviors are several failed marriages or long-term relationships in a short period of time. They show a lack of emotional attachment to partners and repeated infidelity or parallel relationships. This leads to frequent relationship breakups, often without explanation or consideration, and to a financial or emotional exploitation of partners. Since psychopaths are incapable of forming genuine emotional bonds, they often use relationships solely for their personal gain. As soon as the benefit ends or boredom sets in, they leave the partner. An example: a psychopath marries 3 different women within 5 years, leaving emotional and financial damage each time, without showing any remorse. Some people have multiple failed marriages but strive for better relationships. Psychopaths exploit relationships coldly and calculatingly, often leaving damage in their wake. Arthur Fleck had no known romantic relationships or multiple short-term marriages. The supposed relationship with his neighbor Sophie turns out to be a delusion. He seems to have no experience with relationships and appears rather isolated and insecure in social interactions. Psychopaths with a high score in this item would have a long history of unstable, short marriages or affairs, often without any real emotional attachment. This does not apply to Arthur at all. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths often exhibit strongly antisocial behavior even in their youth, manifesting in criminality, violence, or serious rule violations. Typical behaviors in youth are early offenses like theft, burglary, drug trafficking, and violent crimes. They show constant problems with the police, school, or authorities and repeated rule violations without fear of punishment. Psychopaths also show cruelty towards animals or humans and are attracted to gang affiliation or organized crime. Adolescent psychopaths often have little parental control and weak emotional bonds, which leads them to develop delinquent behavior at an early age. Their brains process punishments differently than those of normal people, which is why they are not easily impressed by them. An example: a 15-year-old commits several burglaries, is arrested, but shows no remorse or fear of punishment. Normal teenagers make mistakes, but they learn from them and have a conscience. Psychopathic adolescents exhibit persistent criminal behavior without remorse. There is no evidence that Arthur Fleck was criminal in his youth. The few pieces of information about his past suggest that he was abused and neglected as a child, but there are no reports of delinquency, violent outbursts, or criminal behavior in his youth. Psychopaths with high scores in this item often have a history of theft, vandalism, violence, or other crimes during their teenage years. Arthur, however, does not. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths consistently disregard legal rules and conditions tied to probationary or conditional release. Typical behaviors are recidivism during probation or after release and disregard for court orders, for example drug or reporting requirements. They show repeated offenses after early release and a deception of judicial authorities to obtain a reduced sentence. Psychopaths also show frequent incarcerations due to rule violations. Psychopaths feel superior and have no respect for authority or consequences. They believe that rules do not apply to them and show extremely high recidivism rates. An example: a psychopath is released on probation and commits another serious crime within a few weeks. Some offenders slip back into crime due to external circumstances. Psychopaths consciously break laws because they do not want or cannot adhere to them. Arthur Fleck was never on probation or under a conditional release that could have been revoked. He has no documented criminal record prior to the events of the film. Although he is mentally unstable, there is no evidence that he has ever been released from custody and then reoffended. Psychopaths with a high score in this item often reoffend, violate their probation conditions, and are subsequently incarcerated again. This does not apply to Arthur. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. Psychopaths are not limited to a specific type of crime. They commit a variety of different offenses. Typical criminal activities are violent crimes, like bodily harm, murder, sexual assaults. Economic crime, like fraud, extortion, money laundering. Property crimes, like theft, burglary, robbery. Drug trafficking or organized crime and identity theft or cybercrime. Psychopaths see crime as a means to an end and are not bound to a specific method. They are adaptable and seize every opportunity to achieve their own goals. An example, a psychopath is first arrested for fraud, then commits burglaries, and later violent crimes, always without scruples. Some criminals have a specific specialization, for example fraudsters or burglars. Psychopaths switch flexibly between different crimes. Arthur Fleck does commit several serious acts of violence, but he does not exhibit the criminal versatility typical of psychopathy. His crimes consist solely of murder, like the killing of the 3 men in the subway, his former colleague Randall and Murray Franklin. Arthur shows no interest or involvement in other criminal activities, such as fraud, theft, drug trafficking, burglary, or extortion. His murders are also not motivated by calculation or financial greed, but rather an expression of his psychological instability. Therefore, he earns 0 points for this item. I come to a total score of 5 out of 40 possible points. This means that Arthur Fleck is far below the typical threshold for psychopathy, which is usually considered to be 30 out of 40 possible points. This suggests that he is not a classic psychopath in the sense of the PCLR. His assessment shows that while he does exhibit certain abnormalities in specific areas, particularly regarding lack of empathy, impulsivity, and taking responsibility for his actions, he does not present the typical overall profile of a psychopath. Many of the central characteristics of psychopathy, such as superficial charm, manipulative behavior, or a parasitic lifestyle, are completely absent in him. Instead, Arthur is characterized by deep psychological problems related to his difficult childhood, neglect and abuse, social isolation, and untreated mental illnesses. His acts of violence do not seem calculated or manipulative, but rather are impulsive reactions to personal slights and a sense of hopelessness. In summary, it can be said that Arthur Fleck is not a true psychopath, but rather a tragic figure, a mentally ill, desperate man living in a society that continually pushes him to the margins, until he ultimately becomes the Joker involuntarily.